I fled to a frozen cabin in Michigan's Upper Peninsula in 1978, trying to outrun the grief of losing my wife. I thought I was completely alone in that brutal winter until I followed a blood trail into a cave and discovered I wasn't the only widow on the mountain. I ended up caring for a dying elderly Bigfoot, and the silent companionship we shared through my cabin window ended up saving my life. Before I share this story of survival and unexpected connection, drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from today. And if you want to hear more true stories about encounters in the deep woods, please consider subscribing to the channel. The winter of 1978 wasn't just a season in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, it was a siege. I crossed the Mackinac Bridge in late November, watching the gray steel disappear into a blinding white squall that seemed to swallow the world whole. By the time I turned off the plowed highway onto the logging track that led to my property, the snow was already bumper deep on my old pickup. I wasn't driving into a vacation, I was driving into a void. The further north I went, the more the world stripped itself of color and sound, leaving nothing but the skeletal black lines of the trees against an endless, oppressive white canvas. My destination was a rough-hewn hunting cabin built by my father in the 50s, a structure that hadn't seen a living soul in over a decade. It sat on 40 acres of hardwood and pine, bordered by a frozen creek and a ridge of limestone bluffs that cut off the wind or channeled it, depending on the day. The cabin was a single room of drafty cedar logs with a sleeping loft and a wood stove that looked too small for the job. When I killed the engine, the silence that rushed in was heavy enough to pop your ears. There were no birds, no distant traffic, just the wind hissing through the needles of the pines. That winter was historic, a brutal assault of low-pressure systems that stacked snow 10 feet deep in the drifts. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for weeks, turning the air into something that bit your lungs with every breath. To step outside was to enter a hostile environment where exposed skin would freeze in minutes. The windows of the cabin frosted over on the inside, turning into opaque sheets of ice that I had to scrape just to see the morning light. It was a place where life wasn't lived, it was endured. Survival became a full-time job that demanded every ounce of my fading strength. My entire existence narrowed down to the woodpile. I spent hours every day bucking and splitting fallen maple, the axe handle vibrating in my frozen gloves. If I stopped feeding the stove, the cabin would become a tomb within an hour. I slept in my coat and boots, waking up every 2 hours to stoke the fire, watching my breath plume in the dark. It was a primitive, rhythmic existence that stripped away the complexities of the modern world and left only the raw mechanics of staying alive. The isolation was absolute. The logging road was impassable by December, sealing me in behind a wall of white. There was no electricity, no telephone lines that reached this far back, and the radio only caught static and the occasional Canadian weather report predicting more snow. I was the only human being for 20 miles in any direction. At night, the darkness was complete, a suffocating blackness that pressed against the windows, making the candlelight inside feel fragile and insignificant. I was a speck of heat in a universe of cold. The woods themselves seemed to change under the weight of the snow. The familiar landmarks were buried, the topography smoothed out into deceptive drifts that could swallow a man whole. The trees groaned and cracked in the night, sounding like rifle shots echoing through the valley. It was a landscape that felt indifferent to my presence, perhaps even hostile. Nature here wasn't the scenic backdrop of a postcard. It was a formidable opponent that tested the structural integrity of the cabin and the mental integrity of the man inside it. I learned to read the silence. In the city, silence is just a lack of noise, but in the UP winter, silence has texture. There was the hollow silence of a clear, freezing dawn and the heavy, muffled silence of a coming storm. I watched the barometer on the wall like a religious icon, tapping the glass to see if the pressure was dropping. The wind became my only companion, whistling through the chinking in the logs, a constant, mournful voice that seemed to be trying to tell me that I didn't belong here, that this place was for the wolves and the wind. Food was fuel, nothing more. I had stocked the larder with canned beans, dried meat, and sacks of flour, eating mechanically just to keep the furnace of my body burning. I didn't hunt, even though the woods were full of deer struggling in the deep snow. I didn't have the heart for killing anymore. I watched the animals from my window, gaunt does stripping bark from the cedars, coyotes moving like gray ghosts along the creek bed. We were all in the same boat, fighting a war of attrition against the elements, shivering in our respective dens. The physical hardship was a distraction, a way to keep my body moving so my mind wouldn't have time to think. I welcomed the exhaustion. I welcomed the ache in my back and the blisters on my hands because they anchored me in the physical world. If I was chopping wood, I wasn't thinking about the empty chair back in Detroit. If I was hauling water from the hole in the ice, I wasn't remembering the smell of hospital antiseptic. The brutality of the winter was a calculated choice, a harsh medicine I was force-feeding myself. But as the weeks dragged on and the snow piled higher, the isolation began to play tricks on me. The solitude wasn't empty. It felt populated by the sheer weight of the atmosphere. I started to feel like I was being watched, not by a predator, but by the woods themselves. I would stand on the porch, staring into the tree line, feeling a gaze returning mine from the shadows. I told myself it was just cabin fever, the mind projecting life onto the void. I didn't know yet that I wasn't the only one out there trying to outlast the cold, or that my escape was about to collide with another tragedy hiding in the drifts. They say the silence in the woods is heavy, but it has nothing on the silence of a house in the suburbs after the funeral guests have gone. I sat in my living room in Dearborn, staring at the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light, listening to the grandfather clock tick away seconds that I didn't want. Margaret and I had been married for 40 years, a lifetime built on the rhythm of the auto plant shifts and Sunday dinners. Without her, the house wasn't a home anymore. It was a museum of a life that had ended. Every knick-knack, every cushion, every smell in the kitchen was a landmine of memory that blew me apart the moment I let my guard down. I couldn't look at the recliner in the corner without seeing her sitting there, knitting while we watched the news. I couldn't walk down the hallway without remembering the sound of her cough, that dry, hacking rattle that had become the soundtrack of our last year. The cancer had taken her by inches, stealing the vibrant, laughing woman I loved and leaving a frail shell in a rented hospital bed. I had held her hand until the warmth left it, and when the undertaker carried her out, he took the only reason I had to wake up in the morning with him. I was 61 years old, a retired line worker with a bad back and a heart that had simply stopped beating the moment hers did. The decision to leave wasn't rational, it was a panic response. I felt like I was suffocating in that house. The neighbors meant well, bringing casseroles and pity, but I couldn't stand the look in their eyes. They looked at me like a tragedy, a reminder of what was waiting for them. I needed to run. I needed to go somewhere where nobody knew my name, where nobody knew I was a widower, where the air didn't smell like lilies and antiseptic. I packed my old Ford pickup with a manic energy, throwing in tools, canned goods, and my father's old wool coats, not really caring if I had everything I needed. I drove north on I-75 like a man escaping a bank robbery, watching the city skyline fade in the rearview mirror without a shred of regret. The further I got from Detroit, the lighter my chest felt. I was running toward the one place Margaret and I had never gone together, the old hunting cabin in the UP. She had hated the cold and the roughness of it, so it had always been my solo retreat. Now, it was my exile. I wasn't going there to vacation. I was going there to wait out the clock. I told myself I wanted peace, but deep down, I think I was looking for a place tough enough to match the hardness inside me. When I unlocked the cabin door, the air inside was stale and freezing, smelling of cedar and mice. It should have been depressing, but it felt right. It was cold, empty, and indifferent, exactly how I felt. I didn't sweep the floor, I didn't dust. I just lit the stove, threw my sleeping bag on the cot, and poured 3 fingers of whiskey into a dirty mug. I sat there in the dark, listening to the wind pick up outside, and for the first time in months, I didn't cry. I was too tired. I was numb. I had successfully severed the limb that was causing the pain, or so I thought. The days fell into a gray routine of survival tasks that kept my hands busy and my mind blank. I woke up, I stoked the fire, I made coffee, I chopped wood. The physical labor was a blessing. The ache in my muscles from swinging the splitting maul was a clean, honest pain, unlike the twisting agony in my chest. I worked until I was sweating in the freezing air, punishing my body, maybe hoping that if I worked hard enough, I could sweat the grief out of my pores. I was a machine again, just like on the assembly line, putting one foot in front of the other, refusing to look down the line at where it all ended. But you can't outrun a ghost, especially not one you love. Margaret was everywhere in the silence. I'd hear the floorboards creak and turn around, expecting to see her coming in with a tray of sandwiches. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, reaching across the cot for a warmth that wasn't there, my hand hitting the cold log wall instead. The grief would hit me then, a tidal wave of loneliness that left me gasping for air in the dark. I'd talk to her sometimes, whispering into the gloom, telling her about the snow, about the broken stove hinge, feeling like a madman talking to the walls. I stopped shaving. I stopped looking in the cracked mirror above the wash basin because I didn't recognize the gaunt, wild-eyed man staring back. I was becoming part of the landscape, weathering like the gray siding of the cabin. I told myself I was just wintering over, but the truth was darker. I didn't care if the woodpile lasted until spring. I didn't care if the canned beans ran out. I was waiting for the cold to take me, slowly and quietly, just like the cancer had taken her. I was staging a slow-motion disappearance, erasing myself from the world one snowstorm at a time. Mid-January brought a thaw, a brief cruel respite where the sun came out and the top layer of snow turned to slush before freezing into a sheet of ice. I decided to hike the property line, needing to get away from the four walls that were starting to feel like a coffin. I strapped on my snowshoes and crunched out toward the limestone bluffs on the north ridge. The air was crisp, the sky a blinding hard blue. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. I walked for an hour, my breath pluming, feeling almost human again. I reached the base of the bluffs, a place where the wind had scoured the snow down to the rock. I was about to turn back when I saw something that stopped me dead. There, in the shelter of a limestone overhang, was a set of tracks. They weren't deer. They weren't bear. They were massive barefoot prints, easily 18 inches long, pressed deep into the frozen crust, and they were trailing blood. A lot of it. I stared at the red speckled snow, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I wasn't alone out here, and whatever was sharing my exile was bleeding. I followed the trail not like a hunter, but like a man sleepwalking into a nightmare. The blood was stark against the snow, bright red droplets that had frozen into rubies, marking a path of agony that led straight up into the jagged rocks of the ridge. The wind was whipping around the stone face, biting at my exposed skin, but I didn't feel the cold. My mind was racing, trying to categorize what I was seeing. A bear? A moose? But the stride was wrong. The prints were wrong. They were bipedal, heavy, and dragging, the gait of something walking on two legs that was barely keeping itself upright. The tracks led to a narrow fissure in the limestone, a dark mouth that breathed out a faint warm vapor into the freezing air. I stopped 20 feet away, my heart hammering against my ribs. The smell hitting me wasn't just the musk of a wild animal. It was the heavy, sweet rot scent of sickness. It smelled like old bedding and fever, a smell I knew too well from the last months in the hospice room. I gripped my axe handle, not out of aggression, but out of a need to hold on to something solid. I took a step forward, crunching the snow, and peered into the gloom. At first, I saw nothing but a pile of rags or furs huddled in the back of the shallow cave. Then the pile moved. A massive shoulder heaved and a head turned slowly toward the light. It wasn't a bear. It was a face, gray-skinned and flat-nosed, framed by matted silver-tipped hair. The eyes that locked onto mine were wide and milky with cataracts, but unmistakable in their humanity. It was a Bigfoot, a creature of legend, but there was nothing legendary about the misery in front of me. She, and I knew instantly it was a she, was huddled against the stone wall, shivering so violently that her teeth were chattering with a sound like clicking stones. She tried to rise, a low growl rumbling in her chest, but her legs gave out. She collapsed back onto the bed of pine boughs, coughing a wet, hacking cough that rattled deep in her lungs. The sound froze me in my tracks. It wasn't a roar. It was the exact same sound Margaret had made in those final weeks, the sound of fluid drowning a life. The fear that had been gripping me evaporated, replaced by a gut-wrenching shock of recognition. I wasn't looking at a monster. I was looking at a dying old woman, alone in the cold. She was ancient. The fur on her arms was thinning and patchy, revealing loose gray skin underneath. Her face was a map of deep wrinkles, and her hands, clutching a tattered piece of deer hide, were knobby with arthritis. She looked to be 60, maybe 70 years old, my age. She was starving, her ribs visible even through her winter coat, rising and falling with labored breaths. The blood I had tracked was coming from a gash on her foot, likely cut on the sharp limestone, a wound that wouldn't heal because her body had no energy left to fix it. She looked at me with a mixture of terror and resignation. She knew she was cornered. She knew she couldn't run. But there was no aggression in her posture, only a weary defeat. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly back and forth, trying to generate warmth that her failing metabolism couldn't provide. I stood there, an intruder in her death chamber, feeling a profound sense of shame. I had come here to escape the reality of death, to hide from the ugliness of the end, and here it was, staring back at me from the eyes of a cryptid. I took a step closer, and she flinched, letting out a high-pitched whimper. "It's okay," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm not going to hurt you." I didn't know if she understood words, but she seemed to understand the tone. She didn't attack. She just watched me, her breathing ragged. I looked around the cave. It was pitiful. A few gnawed bones, a pile of dry leaves, no food, no water. She was dehydrating and freezing to death by inches, waiting for the final darkness to take her. The parallel was unbearable. I saw Margaret in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines, fighting for every breath. I saw the helplessness, the indignity of the body failing the spirit. But Margaret had me. She had nurses. She had warmth and morphine. This creature had nothing but the cold stone and the howling wind. It seemed cosmically unfair that something so magnificent, something that had survived decades in this harsh wilderness, should end like this, shivering and alone in a hole in the ground. I backed away slowly, unable to look at her misery any longer. She watched me go, her head drooping back onto her chest, her eyes closing as if she didn't care if I returned with a gun or not. I stumbled back down the ridge, my legs feeling like lead. The beauty of the winter landscape was gone, replaced by a stark, cruel indifference. The trees looked like prison bars. The snow looked like a shroud. I had found the monster of the woods, and she was just another casualty of time. I made it back to the cabin and collapsed into my chair, staring at the iron stove. I couldn't get the sound of that cough out of my head. I tried to drink my coffee, but it tasted like ash. I had run hundreds of miles to get away from grief, only to find it waiting for me in a cave 2 miles from my door. I knew I should stay away. I knew it was dangerous. But I also knew with a heavy, sinking certainty that I couldn't let her die like that. I couldn't sit here in my warm cabin while she froze. I had failed to save Margaret, but I couldn't just watch this happen again. I went back the next morning, driven by a nagging curiosity that felt more like a haunting. The wind had died down, leaving a silence that felt reverent, almost church-like. I approached the cave slowly, my hands empty and open to show I held no weapons. She was there, exactly where I had left her, but in the daylight, I noticed something I had missed in the shadows of the previous evening. To the left of her bedding, deeper in the recess of the overhang, was a mound of earth and stones. It wasn't a random rockfall, it was a structure, carefully piled and packed with a deliberate, heartbreaking precision. I stepped closer, ignoring the warning tingle in my spine. The mound was about 7 feet long, covered in heavy river stones that must have been hauled up from the creek valley below. A feat of strength that would have taken days. On top of the stones lay a pair of massive weathered elk antlers, crossed over each other like a headstone. It was a cairn, a grave. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't just living here, she was keeping a vigil. She was guarding the bones of someone she had lost. I looked at her, and she wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the pile of stones with a look of infinite weariness. She reached out a trembling hand and rested it on the nearest rock, stroking the rough surface with a tenderness that made my throat tight. It was the gesture of a wife smoothing the blanket over a sleeping husband. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that her mate lay beneath those stones. She hadn't been abandoned by a pack. She had been left behind by death, stranded in the winter of her life without her partner. The timeline made sense in a tragic way. The earth around the grave was settled, the stones covered in a season's worth of lichen and frost. He had likely died in the autumn, maybe earlier. She had spent the last few months dragging stones up a cliff, exhausting her remaining reserves to build him a monument, and then she had simply laid down beside him to wait for her turn. She wasn't just dying of age and cold, she was dying of a broken heart. She was fading away because the other half of her soul was gone. I sank down onto a boulder near the entrance, the strength draining from my legs. I looked at the grave, and then I looked at my own hands, still calloused from gripping the steering wheel as I drove away from the cemetery in Detroit. I saw the fresh earth on Margaret's plot, the way the rain had darkened the soil. I felt the phantom weight of the wedding ring I had taken off and put in my pocket because I couldn't bear to look at it. This creature and I were separated by millions of years of evolution, but we were standing in the exact same shadow. The connection was sudden and terrifyingly intimate. I had thought my grief was unique, a complex human emotion that required poetry and philosophy to understand. But here was a wild thing, a monster, displaying a loyalty that transcended biology. She was starving herself to stay close to him. She was enduring the freezing wind just to be near his bones. It humbled me. It made my flight to the cabin look cowardly. I had run away from Margaret's memory. She had built a shrine to hers and refused to leave it. She coughed again, a wet, rattling sound that shook her frail frame, but she didn't take her hand off the grave. She looked at me then, her milky eyes searching my face. There was no fear left in her, just a dull, shared understanding. She saw me looking at the stones and she didn't growl. She seemed to know that I understood what that pile meant. We sat there in the silence, two widows staring at the evidence of our loss, breathing the same cold air, united by the universal language of absence. I realized that her sickness wasn't just physical, it was the widowhood effect, the phenomenon where one spouse dies shortly after the other because the immune system simply gives up. She had lost her purpose. Her mate had probably been the hunter, the protector, the one who broke the trail through the snow. Without him, she was lost, unmoored in a world that demanded strength she no longer possessed. She was waiting to join him, just as I had been waiting in my cabin, letting the woodpile run low and the fire die down. The fear of the other vanished completely. I didn't see a Bigfoot anymore. I saw a lonely old soul who had loved someone enough to bury them under a ton of rock. I saw the dignity in her suffering. I remembered how I had brushed Margaret's hair when she was too weak to lift her arms, how I had read to her when she couldn't speak. I looked at this creature, shivering in the filth, and I felt a surge of protective anger, not at her, but at the cruelty of the situation. She shouldn't have to die like this, cold and hungry and covered in her own waste. I stood up, wiping a hand across my eyes. I couldn't bring her mate back. I couldn't bring Margaret back. That door was closed forever. But I could change the ending of this specific chapter. I looked at her and nodded, a promise made in the silence. "Not today," I whispered, my voice rough. "You don't go today." I turned and marched back down the ridge, my pace faster this time, driven by a new, desperate mission. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I had a patient to tend to. I returned an hour later, my rucksack heavy with cans of peaches, beef stew, and a loaf of stale bread I had been saving. I felt foolish, scrambling up the icy rocks like a delivery boy for a monster, but the image of her shivering face drove me on. When I reached the cave, she hadn't moved. I opened a can of peaches with my knife, the metal lid curling back to reveal the bright orange fruit and syrup. I slid the can across the stone floor until it bumped against her hand. She stared at it, sniffing the sweet air, then dipped a finger into the syrup. The moment she tasted the sugar, her lethargy broke. She ate with a desperate, trembling speed, tilting the can to drink the syrup, making sounds of pure, primal relief. The next day, I escalated the mission. Food wasn't enough. The cold was killing her faster than hunger. I raided my cedar chest for the heaviest wool blankets I owned, 2 Hudson Bay point blankets that weighed 5 pounds each. Walking into the cave with them felt like walking into a lion's den with a stake tied to my neck. I moved slow, talking constantly in a low, monotone voice. "Here we go, old girl," I murmured. "This will help. This keeps the wind out." I approached her, my heart hammering, and draped the first blanket over her shoulders. She tensed, her muscles bunching, but the moment the heavy wool settled on her freezing skin, she let out a long, shuddering sigh and pulled it tight. By the 3rd day, I was playing doctor. The gash on her foot was angry and swollen, the infection radiating heat that I could feel through my gloves. I boiled water on my wood stove and brought a pot of it up the ridge, along with a bottle of iodine and clean rags. This was the test. I knelt at her feet, risking a kick that could shatter my skull. She watched me, her eyes lucid and wary. When I poured the warm water over the wound, she hissed and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was iron, strong enough to crush bone, but she didn't squeeze. She held me there, testing my intent, then slowly released me. I cleaned the wound, applied the stinging iodine, and wrapped it. She watched the entire process with a fascination that felt almost human. I found myself falling into a routine that was painfully familiar. I wasn't just dropping off supplies, I was caretaking. I spent hours cleaning the cave, removing the soiled bedding and replacing it with fresh pine boughs I cut myself. I cleared the snow from the entrance to let the sun hit the stone floor. It was the same work I had done for Margaret in those final months, changing sheets, adjusting pillows, trying to engineer a little bit of comfort in a situation that was fundamentally broken. I was finding redemption in the labor, scrubbing away my guilt with every act of service for this creature who had no one else. I started bringing up my own meals to eat with her. I'd sit on a rock near the entrance, eating my beans while she picked at the venison jerky I brought. I talked to her about everything and nothing, the weather, the Detroit Lions, the price of gas. It didn't matter that she couldn't answer. It mattered that we weren't eating alone. I told her about Margaret, about how she used to hum when she cooked, about how unfair it was that she was gone. The creature would listen, tilting her head, her large ears twitching at the cadence of my voice. In those moments, the species barrier dissolved. We were just 2 old survivors sharing a lunch break in purgatory. The transformation in her was slow but undeniable. The antibiotics I crushed into her food began to knock back the infection. The constant supply of calories put a little light back in her eyes. She started grooming herself again, smoothing the matted fur on her arms, which I took as a sign of returning dignity. She wasn't just a dying animal anymore. She was a patient in recovery. Watching her strength return gave me a vicarious thrill, a victory that I had been denied in the hospital room. I hadn't been able to save my wife, but by God, I was going to save this widow. I realized I was pouring all my unspent love into this project. All the care I hadn't been able to give Margaret because the cancer was too fast, or because I was too scared, I was giving to her. I brought her a battery-powered lantern so she wouldn't have to sit in the dark. I brought her a jar of honey because I found out she had a sweet tooth. I was doting on a 7-foot beast in the middle of a blizzard, and for the first time in a year, I felt useful. My own aches and pains vanished. I had a job. I had a purpose. I was the ward of the woods. One afternoon, a blizzard rolled in, dropping visibility to 0. I couldn't make the climb safely, so I stayed in the cabin, pacing the floor, worried sick about whether she had enough food. The anxiety was a sharp, biting thing. I realized I had become attached. I wasn't just observing a specimen. I was worrying about a friend. When the storm broke the next morning, I practically ran up the ridge, dreading what I might find. When I got there, she was sitting up, wrapped in the blankets, looking at the entrance with an expression that looked unmistakably like relief. She had been waiting for me. The dynamic shifted after that. She wasn't just passively accepting help. She was participating in the exchange. She started saving things for me. Interesting stones, a shed antler she found in the back of the cave, placing them near where I usually sat. It was a primitive barter system, food for trinkets, care for acknowledgement. She allowed me to check her foot without hesitation, lifting her leg for inspection like a trained dog, though the intelligence in her eyes was far more complex. She was trusting me with her vulnerability, the highest compliment a wild thing can give. Then came the day I arrived to find the cave empty. My heart stopped. I dropped the rucksack and scanned the interior, thinking she had crawled off to die or been taken by a predator. But the blankets were folded, clumsily but deliberately, in the corner. The fire pit I had built for her was cold. I spun around, panic rising, and looked out over the valley. There, halfway down the slope, moving with a stiff but determined gait through the snow, was a dark shape. She wasn't running away. She was heading toward the creek, toward the cabin. She was coming to find me. She didn't knock, of course. I was sitting by the wood stove reading a paperback I had already finished twice when the light in the room changed. A massive shadow fell across the floorboards, blocking the moonlight streaming through the front window. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat, expecting a bear or a break-in. But when I looked up, there she was, a silhouette pressed against the frosted glass, her breath fogging the pain. She wasn't trying to get in. She was sitting on the edge of the porch, her back resting against the log wall, just inches from where I sat on the inside. I slowly dragged my rocking chair over to the window, the legs scraping loudly on the wood. She turned her head at the sound, her large dark eyes catching the reflection of the firelight from inside. We stared at each other through the double-pane glass, two different species separated by a 1/4 inch of vacuum-sealed air. She looked better, heavier, her coat thicker, the desperation gone from her posture. She had come down from the ridge not for food, but for the heat leaking through the uninsulated walls, and I suspected, for the company. It became our nightly ritual. As soon as the sun dipped below the tree line, I would hear the heavy thump-thump of her footsteps on the porch stairs. I would brew a pot of coffee, pour myself a mug, and sit by the window. She would settle in outside, wrapping her arms around her knees, watching the snow fall. It felt strangely like visiting hours at the hospital, that quiet time in the evening when the nurses stop bustling and you just sit with the person you love, saying nothing because there's nothing left to say. I started talking to her through the glass. It started as a habit, a way to fill the silence, but it quickly became a lifeline. I read the news to her from month-old papers. I told her about the assembly line at Ford, about the noise and the heat. I told her about the garden Margaret used to keep, about the tomatoes that never quite ripened before the frost. She would listen, her head tilting at the sound of my voice, sometimes pressing her palm against the glass. I would press my hand against hers on the inside, feeling the cold of the window against my skin, imagining the warmth of her hand on the other side. The glass was a barrier, but it was also a safety valve. It allowed us to be intimate without the threat of biology getting in the way. If she had been in the room, her sheer size and wildness would have been terrifying. But with the window between us, I could study her face, the deep grooves of age, the intelligence in her eyes, the way snowflakes caught in her eyelashes. And she could study me, the strange, hairless ape in his heated box. We were specimens to each other, but we were also companions in the void. I found myself mimicking the tone I used with Margaret when the pain was bad. "It's all right," I'd whisper when the wind howled and shook the cabin. "We're okay. The roof is strong." I was soothing myself as much as her. The act of comforting another living thing, even a 7-foot cryptid, tricked my brain into feeling less vulnerable. I wasn't the lonely old man anymore. I was the protector, the voice of reason in the storm. The cabin stopped feeling like a coffin and started feeling like a lighthouse. One night, the temperature dropped to 30 below, a killing frost that cracked the trees like gunshots. She sat on the porch, shivering despite the blankets I had given her, refusing to leave my proximity. I stoked the stove until the metal turned cherry red, trying to push as much heat through the walls as I could. I pulled my cot right up to the window and slept there, waking up every hour to check on her. Every time I opened my eyes, she was there, a dark sentinel guarding my sleep. We weathered the night together, separated by a wall but united by the singular goal of seeing the sunrise. She began to take an interest in my domestic life. She watched me wash dishes, her eyes tracking the movement of the rag. She watched me whittle wood by the fire. It was like living in a fishbowl, performing the mundane acts of humanity for an audience of one. It made me conscious of my own existence again. I washed my face more often. I straightened the cabin. I felt a responsibility to maintain a standard of living because I was being observed. I wasn't just fading away into the filth anymore. I was keeping house for my guest. The grief that had been a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest began to dull into a heavy, manageable ache. Margaret was still gone, but the crushing loneliness was abating. I realized that this creature was filling the exact same space in the ecosystem of my life that a spouse fills. The presence of another heartbeat in the room, the sound of breathing that isn't your own. It didn't matter that she was a Bigfoot. It mattered that when I looked out the window, the world wasn't empty. But as February turned to March, the dynamic shifted again. She stopped just sitting. She started standing at the window, gesturing with her long, dark fingers. She would point to the sky, then to the trees, then to me. She would tap on the glass, insistent and focused, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that demanded attention. She wasn't just visiting anymore. She was trying to tell me something. She was trying to get me to come outside, to leave the safety of the box and step into her world. The tapping on the glass became a command I couldn't ignore. I pulled on my heavy coat, grabbed my gloves, and stepped out onto the porch into the biting wind. She didn't retreat this time. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, waiting for me, her breath pluming in the gray light. When I reached the bottom step, she turned and began to walk toward the tree line, looking back over her shoulder to ensure I was following. It wasn't a casual stroll. It was a guided tour. She led me away from the safety of the cabin and into the deep woods, moving with a purpose that told me the time for sitting by the fire was over. Her first lesson was about the sky. We stopped in a clearing and she pointed a long, dark finger at the horizon where the clouds were banking in a specific, bruised, purple formation. She sniffed the air, then looked at the behavior of the crows circling the pines. She mimicked their erratic flight, then crouched low and covered her head. 2 hours later, a squall hit that buried the cabin in 6 inches of fresh powder. She was teaching me to read the barometer of the wilderness, showing me that the weather reports on the radio were hours behind the reality that the birds and the wind already knew. She took me to the edge of the frozen swamp, a place I usually avoided because of the treacherous footing. She knelt in the snow and began to dig, her massive hands moving the earth with surprising delicacy. She pulled up a tangle of thin golden roots. Gold thread, I later learned. She bit off a piece and chewed it, grimacing, then offered a piece to me. I hesitated, then chewed. It was bitter enough to turn my mouth inside out, but within minutes, the sore throat I had been nursing for days began to numb. She was showing me the pharmacy under the snow, the medicine that would keep me alive when the aspirin ran out. The parallel hit me hard as we walked. I remembered Margaret in those final weeks, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger, trying to show me how to balance the checkbook and when to pay the insurance premiums. I had been angry then, shouting that I didn't want to learn because it meant admitting she wouldn't be there to do it. I saw the same urgency in the creature's eyes now. She was tired, her movements slowing, but she pushed on. She was cramming a lifetime of survival knowledge into a few weeks, terrified that she would leave me helpless in a world I didn't fully understand. She taught me how to walk. I thought I knew how to move in the woods, but watching her, I realized I walked like a bulldozer. She showed me how to roll my weight from the outside of the foot to the inside, how to test the snow crust before committing my weight. She would stop and glare at me when I snapped a twig, making me retrace my steps until I could move through the brush without a sound. It wasn't just about hunting. It was about not announcing your presence to everything in the valley. She was teaching me how to become a ghost, how to exist in the landscape rather than just trample through it. We spent an afternoon by a deadfall, where she peeled strips of silver birch bark and dug into the heart of a rotten stump to find the resin-soaked fatwood inside. She built a small fire in the snow using nothing but friction and these materials, shielding the spark with her body. She pointed to the black smoke, then to the white steam, teaching me the difference between a signal fire and a heating fire. She was giving me the keys to warmth, showing me that the forest was full of fuel if you knew where to look, ensuring that if the stove ever went out, I wouldn't freeze. She showed me the water. We hiked to a spot where the creek narrowed between 2 granite boulders. The ice was thick everywhere else, but here the water ran fast and black, never freezing. She knelt and drank, then pointed to the specific moss growing on the rocks. She was showing me the permanent springs, the sources that wouldn't fail even in the deepest freeze. It was a map of survival etched into her mind, and she was transferring it to mine, landmark by landmark, ensuring I knew where the lifeblood of the valley flowed. The lessons were physical, but the intent was deeply emotional. Sometimes she would stop and lean against a tree, her breath rattling in her chest, the exhaustion plain on her face. I would try to guide her back to the cabin, but she would shake her head and point to the next ridge. She was running out of time, and she knew it. The desperation in her teaching broke my heart. She wasn't saving herself. She was securing her legacy. She was making sure that the creature she had adopted, the hairless, clumsy ape, wouldn't die the moment she was gone. One evening, she led me to the boundary of her territory, a ring of trees marked with deep scratches and twisted branches. She walked the line, touching the marks, then looking at me. She was formally transferring the deed. She was showing me the edges of the safe zone, the places where her scent still lingered to keep the coyotes and the wolves at bay. It was an inheritance. She was leaving me the only thing she owned, her territory, her knowledge, and her place in the hierarchy of the woods. As we walked back to the cabin under a heavy moon, I watched her limp ahead of me, her silhouette stark against the snow. I finally understood what she was doing. Margaret had labeled the breaker box and organized the tax files because she loved me. This creature was teaching me to eat bitter roots and walk silently for the same reason. It was the final, selfless act of the dying, to equip the living for the solitude that was coming. She was preparing me to be alone, and in doing so, she was giving me the confidence to face the silence. The end didn't come with a storm, but with the first true day of spring. The icicles hanging from the eaves began to drip, a steady rhythm that sounded like a ticking clock, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine resin. She hadn't come to the window for 3 nights. I knew what it meant. I didn't feel the panic I had felt in January. I felt a solemn, heavy certainty. I packed my rucksack not with food this time, but with a heavy canvas tarp from the shed and my spade. I drank my coffee standing up, watching the sun hit the ridge, then began the climb to the cave one last time. She was lying exactly where I knew she would be, curled up next to the mound of stones where her mate lay. She looked small somehow, deflated by the absence of the spirit that had animated her. She had died in her sleep, her hand resting near the cairn, her face relaxed and free of pain. The silence in the cave wasn't empty. It was complete. I stood there for a long time, listening to the drip of meltwater from the limestone, feeling the strange, hollow ache of losing a friend who had never spoken a word to me, yet had told me everything I needed to know. I didn't try to move her. She belonged here. I spent the afternoon hauling more stones from the scree slope, working until my hands were raw and my back screamed in protest. I extended the cairn, building a second mound beside the first, covering her body with the weight of the mountain she loved. It was a funeral rite, as ancient as the species she belonged to. Placing the final stone, I felt a knot loosen in my chest that had been tight since the day of Margaret's funeral. I hadn't been able to bury Margaret myself. The professionals had done that. But I could do this. I could give this widow the dignity of a proper rest, side by side with the one she mourned. I sat by the twin graves as the sun began to set, the valley below turning a deep, bruised purple. It was there, in the quiet, that the pieces finally fit together. I thought about Margaret showing me the breaker box and the tax files, her voice thin but determined. I thought about the creature showing me the gold thread roots and the weather signs. They were the same lesson. 2 wives facing the end, using their last breaths to make sure the stubborn, helpless men they left behind wouldn't freeze in the dark. I realized then that grief isn't a punishment, it's a graduation. Margaret hadn't left me to suffer, she had left me to live. And the creature hadn't saved me just so I could survive the winter. She had saved me so I could bear witness. They had both handed me a torch, one of domestic memory, one of wild survival, and told me to keep carrying it. I wasn't running away from my life anymore. I was standing in the center of it, equipped with the tools they had forced into my hands. I walked back down the mountain in the twilight, moving with the rolling, silent gait she had taught me. I didn't crunch through the snow. I flowed over it. I reached the cabin and didn't feel the crushing weight of emptiness I expected. The cabin wasn't a tomb for a widower. It was a shelter for a survivor. I looked at the wood stove, the stack of dried roots on the shelf, the heavy wool blankets folded on the cot. I was ready. I could stay here. I could survive here. The snow melted rapidly in the following weeks, revealing the brown earth and the first green shoots of fiddlehead ferns. I didn't pack the truck. I didn't drive back to Detroit to sell the house and fade away in front of a television set. I stayed. I planted a garden in the patch of sun behind the shed, using the seeds I found in the pocket of my old coat. I reinforced the roof, I walked the boundary line she had shown me, maintaining the perimeter, the custodian of a territory that was now mine to protect. I still talk to them. In the mornings when the coffee is fresh, I talk to Margaret, telling her about the garden and the birds. In the evenings, when the shadows stretch long from the ridge, I talk to the creature, telling her about the wind and the deer. I am a man living with two ghosts, but they are benevolent spirits. They are the bookends of my life, the city and the wild, the past and the present. I am no longer defined by who I lost, but by what they left me. Sometimes, hikers or loggers come down the road, looking lost or looking for trouble. I watch them from the tree line, standing perfectly still, blending into the shadows just like she taught me. They never see me. They feel eyes on them, shiver and move on, telling stories in town about the old man in the woods who moves like a ghost. They don't know that I'm not hiding from them. I'm just living in a world they can't see. A world gifted to me by a dying giant who taught me that even in the deepest winter, life finds a way to endure. I am Robert Brennan, age 62. I am a widower, a survivor, and the keeper of the ridge. The silence doesn't scare me anymore because I know how to listen to it. I know that the wind is just the earth breathing, and that as long as I remember the lessons, I will never truly be alone. The winter broke me, but it also remade me, forging a new man in the cold fires of loss. A man strong enough to carry the weight of 2 lifetimes on his shoulders and still keep walking.